Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into some serious data. We're looking at how we can quantify objectively this sense that older Americans might be getting more disconnected.
Right. And just to be really clear up front for everyone listening, this session is strictly about defining the problem. We're looking at the facts, the baseline data.
No solutions today.
No solutions, no interventions, no policy debates. That's not the focus. We're just establishing the factual groundwork using major federal data sources to show why this is seen as such a critical issue now at a population level.
Got it. Setting the stage, basically. Arming you, the listener, with the core numbers. So where do we start? I guess with the most basic things. Sheer numbers. The scale of the over 65 population.
Exactly. Scale is fundamental here because the risk just balloons with the size of the group. And the growth has been, well, pretty dramatic.
How dramatic are we talking?
Okay, so look back at 2012. The 65-plus group was about 43.1 million people in the U.S.
Okay.
Fast forward just 10 years to 2022. That number jumped to almost 57.8 million.
Wow, that's a huge leap in only a decade. Nearly 60 million.
It is. And it puts enormous pressure on everything, right? Healthcare, housing, you name it. But it doesn't stop there.
It keeps growing.
Oh, yeah. The projections for 2040 put the number at roughly 78.3 million Americans aged 65 or older.
78 million. That's hard to even picture. What's a comparison for that?
Think about it like this. 78 million is about the same as the entire population of California and Florida combined right now.
Okay, that puts it in perspective. A massive cohort.
And that's the key takeaway the sources emphasize. It's compound growth. So even if, say, only 10 or 15% face a certain social risk, when your total pool is approaching 80 million people...
That percentage translates into millions and millions of individuals. Huge absolute numbers.
Precisely. The sheer scale magnifies even modest risk rates into a major societal challenge.
Right. That makes the scale itself a critical factor. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit more. Moving from the total number to how people are actually living. Objective isolation. We know living alone isn't automatically loneliness, but it does increase the risk, yeah.
It definitely increases exposure risk. And the data on living arrangements, specifically for older adults not in nursing homes or institutions, shows some really clear patterns.
Like what? What's the overall picture?
Overall, for the 65-plus group living in the community, about 28% live alone. So more than a quarter.
Okay, 1 in 4. Is there a gender difference there?
Oh, absolutely. A significant one. For men 65 and older, it's around 22% living alone.
Lower than the average.
Right. But for women 65 plus, it's higher, around 33%. And here's where age really makes a difference. Look at women age 75 and older.
What happens then?
The rate just rockets up. 42% of women 75 and older live alone.
42%. Almost half.
Right.
That's a really striking statistic.
It is. And it signals major potential challenges for support systems. Now, if living alone increases the odds of having less daily contact.
The researchers looked at actual time spent alone too, right? Not just the living situation itself.
Exactly. They use time-used data.
Yeah.
This is where government statisticians track, like hour by hour, how people spend their days. It lets us quantify daily solitude, the actual waking hours spent without another person present.
That sounds fascinating. What did they find? Let's take the sort of younger, older adults first, maybe 65 to 74.
Okay. For that group, 65 to 74, the average time spent alone during waking hours is about 7.75 hours per day. 7.78 hours to be exact.
So nearly 8 hours a day alone on average.
Yeah. And then when you look at adults 75 and older, it climbs higher. It actually exceeds 8 hours a day on average. The figure is about 8.31 hours.
8 hours. Wow. For the 75-plus group, that's basically a standard workday spent alone. Just sitting with that average feels pretty heavy.
It does. But here's the crucial analytical point for you listening. These are averages. Population averages.
Right. So if the average is 8 hours.
What does that imply about the distribution? It means there has to be a significant number of people way out on the right tail of that curve.
Meaning people experiencing much, much more than 8 hours of solitude.
Exactly. It strongly suggests there's a substantial group spending, 10, 12, maybe even more waking hours completely alone, day after day. That average already signals concern, but the distribution implies a pocket of really profound isolation for some.
That really clarifies the objective side. Okay, so we've got the growing population scale, we've got living alone stats, and average time alone. Let's shift gears slightly to the quality or maybe the frequency of connection, specifically with close friends. There's data on that too, right?
Yes. The National Poll on Healthy Aging provides insights here, looking at adults aged 50 and older. And what it shows is what the sources term a compression of contact.
Compression, meaning less frequent.
Essentially, yeah. A shift away from regular, frequent check-ins. The data shows only about 23% of adults 50 plus have contact with a close friend daily or almost daily.
Just under a quarter get that daily touch point. That feels low.
It does. Now, if you broaden it slightly to at least weekly contact, so once a week or more, you only capture 40% of this group.
So 60%, the majority, are not connecting with a close friend even once a week.
Correct. That weekly threshold isn't being met for most older adults, based on this poll.
Okay, so where does that leave the rest? This must be where the compression really hits hard.
It really does. The data point that stands out is that 36%, over a third, report contact with close friends only monthly, or even less often than monthly.
Monthly or less. Wow. So for a huge chunk of this population, that crucial support system of friendship is really thinning out in terms of regular interaction.
Exactly. If you think of a close friend as a key buffer, someone you rely on, having that contact maybe just a handful of times a year, that's a significant lack of support for over a third of these folks.
That 36% figure really hammers home the idea that friendship networks might be becoming less resilient, less available for many.
The sources definitely point to that erosion of frequent touch points as a major factor driving the subjective feelings we need to talk about next.
Right, which brings us straight to loneliness itself. We've looked at the objective side, living alone, time alone, contact frequency. What happens when you just ask people how they feel? What's the prevalence of reported loneliness?
And the prevalence numbers really underscore the scale again. Roughly one-third, that's 33% of adults aged 50 and older, say they feel lonely some of the time or often.
One-third. Again, not some small fringe group. That's a massive proportion experiencing loneliness regularly.
It's widespread, absolutely. And there's another related figure. About one quarter, so 25% of all U.S. adults report that they lack adequate social or emotional support.
So whether it's the feeling of loneliness or a perceived lack of actual support, we're talking about a quarter to a third of the older adult population.
Yes. And the key conclusion from the sources is that these numbers are undeniably large enough. This isn't just individual sad stories. It's a population-level risk factor that requires serious attention from a governance perspective.
Okay. Before we get to the consequences of all this, I want to make sure we're clear on terminology. The experts draw a line between social isolation and loneliness, right? How do they define those differently? It seems important for measurement.
It's a critical distinction, yeah. Especially when thinking about potential interventions down the line, even though we aren't discussing those today. Basically, social isolation is the objective part.
The facts.
Right. It's measurable stuff. How many social ties do you have? Do you live alone? How often do you actually have contact? It's quantifiable.
Okay.
And loneliness. Loneliness is subjective. It's the feeling, it's the gap between the connection you want, quality and quantity, and the connection you perceive you actually have.
So you can be isolated but not lonely, or surrounded by people but still feel lonely?
Precisely. Isolation is the circumstance. Loneliness is the internal experience of that circumstance, or lack thereof.
And how do researchers measure that subjective feeling accurately? It seems tricky.
They use validated tools, things like the well-known UCLA loneliness scale, or sometimes composite scores that combine answers to several questions. But importantly, they often use a framework that looks at both.
Like plotting them against each other.
Exactly. Think of a matrix. Contact frequency on one axis, reported loneliness on the other. This helps distinguish different situations.
What does that show you?
It's powerful because it separates, for instance, someone who has objectively low contact, lives alone, sees few people but reports low loneliness. They might be perfectly content, resilient.
Okay. The satisfied loner type, maybe?
Sort of. And then it distinguishes them from someone who might have objectively high contact, lots of activities, people around, but reports high loneliness.
Ah, so the connections they have aren't meeting their needs somehow.
Right. Maybe they're superficial or not the right kind of support. That matrix helps capture that nuance, that disconnect between objective reality and subjective feeling.
That's a really useful distinction. Okay, so we have this large, growing population, significant objective isolation for many, widespread subjective loneliness. Now, for the big, so what? What's the cost? Here's where it gets really important, I think. The actual health consequences. What does the data show?
And this is where the numbers become quite alarming. We're talking about significant increases in risk for major health outcomes. For premature mortality, dying earlier than expected, loneliness and social isolation are linked to a relative risk increase of somewhere between 26 and 29%.
Wow. Just being isolated increases your risk of dying early by over a quarter. It's huge. What about specific diseases?
Also, significant bumps. The risk of developing heart disease goes up by about 29%, and the risk of having a stroke, that increases by 32%.
32% higher risk of stroke. These aren't small effects.
Not at all. The biological pathways are complex, involve stress hormones, inflammation, maybe changes in health behaviors. But the consistency of the findings across studies and the sheer magnitude of the risk increases are what really command attention.
They're staggering numbers on their own. But there was that comparison made in the federal advisory, wasn't there? Something to make the risk feel more concrete.
Yes, exactly. To drive the point home for policymakers and the public, they needed a powerful analogy. The advisory stated that the combined health risk impact of chronic loneliness and social isolation is comparable in its order of magnitude
To what?
to smoking up to 15 cigarettes every single day.
15 cigarettes a day. Okay, that lands. That immediately shifts this from a sort of sad social issue to a major physical health hazard category, like on par with warnings we've seen for decades.
That's precisely the intent behind using that comparison. It cuts through the abstract nature of loneliness and frames it as a serious biological threat affecting millions. It elevates the urgency.
Right. So let's try to wrap this deep dive up. We've laid out the problem definition based on the data. We've got this rapidly growing older population heading towards 80 million.
Check.
We see quantifiable objective isolation, many living alone, especially older women, and significant average time spent alone daily, implying extremes for some.
Yep, the objective metrics are clear.
Then there's the compression of contact with close friends, with over a third having monthly or even less frequent contact.
Or major erosion of a key support.
And subjective loneliness is widespread, reported by a third, alongside a quarter feeling unsupported.
The prevalence is undeniable.
And finally, the kicker. The health risks are severe, comparable in impact to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day.
Huge mortality, heart disease, and stroke risks. And just to reiterate for everyone, these aren't just numbers we pulled out of thin air.
Right, the sources are key.
These facts are grounded in specific, citable federal data and reports from the Administration for Community Living, the Bureau of Labor Statistics Time Use Survey, the National Poll on Healthy Aging, the CDC, and that HHS Surgeon General's advisory. As the source material concludes, this completes the problem definition for family and friend connection.
Okay, and that leads us perfectly to the final thought we want to leave you with, reflecting on the sheer magnitude we've just outlined. If we accept that this population is nearing 78 million, and a significant portion faces health risks like smoking 15 cigarettes daily, what happens next?
What's the implication?
Yeah, what happens when we inevitably start translating that massive individual risk into systemic burdens? The cost for healthcare, for long-term care, the strain on the entire social safety net. We've defined the problem's scale and severity. The consequences must be enormous.
And that is precisely the next logical step indicated by the source materials. Future analyses will undoubtedly examine those very costs and system constraints that stem directly from the problem we've defined today. We've outlined the danger. The downstream impact is the next chapter.